Our next panel is about water security and how sanitation is vital for water security. Please, welcome. So we had a great conversation before, so I hope we'll be up to speed to have this subject. I have with me Nutan Zarapkar, your Head of Water Sanitation and Hygiene for RTE International India. Thank you to be with us. Erik, Harvey, Program Support Director for WATERAID. And Vairavamoorthy, Executive Director of the International Water Association. Thank you. Before I ask our panelists about how they are acting and what are their view on the water security issue and how sanitation is key to that, I just would like to give you a simple key facts and definition of what is water security. I think it's important because when we talk about water security, sometimes we think about big disasters and big events, which are actually more and more present with the climate change issue we are facing. 9 to 10 disasters are linked to water: flood, droughts, storms. Water is really responsible for that. So we need, of course, to build more resilient systems in order to face that. However, water security is also about environmental justice, and we talked about that as well. Water security is about sustainable and equitable access on a watershed basis to adequate quantities of water and quality of water to ensure human and ecosystem health. We're seeing now with climate change and impact of ecosystems of our way of consuming and producing a lot of impact that we have to manage now. If we take, for example, the situation in India, especially on water quality, we are saying that almost 80% of India's surface water is polluted, and an alarming percentage of groundwater water is also polluted with organic and inorganic pollutants. And it is estimated that in this water contamination, 80% in volume is due to sanitation. This impacts, of course, the quality, but also the availability of water. Scarcity in water in many countries is already happening. We have about half of the global population who is now living at least 1 month of water scarcity per year, which is rising, and once again, we will have to face more and more of this in the year to come. So having said that, I'd like to ask to our panel to give us their view on these challenges and how their organization are contributing to that. And I'd like to start with you, Nutan. We have heard these alarmist reports and news about the water situation in India, and I'd like to know how RTI is acting with many other actors, I'm sure, in India to face this challenge. And maybe if you have one tremendous project or something that is a bit different that you would like to share with us in order to show us a way on how you're acting on that in India.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nice to hear the voice. So I'm Nutan here. I have 23 years experience in the water sector, and my age is also 23. I expect some laugh. So just telling you why did I come into the sector. I was offered a seat in computer engineering, and at that time I thought that it's better to do chemical engineering because someone told me that environment sector is the next booming sector after IT. And I thought, okay, fine, let me try my hands at doing chemical engineering and being in the water sector. So therefore I came into water sector. When I started working, I realized that it's not a lot of money as an IT person would get. I was a little depressed. But at the same time, I realized that the potential to really shape up this market is really very huge. So I feel that from a water side, I think there's a big market opportunity in the sector. By saying so, I think you spoke very well about the local condition in water. I would just like to cite 2 examples of the local conditions. I think we have a client in Rajasthan, and I can tell you that the problem with him is that he's really looking at taking water for his industries right from the open drains which are currently lying there. So that is the real situation on the ground as far as industries are concerned. They are really, really struggling hard to get any source of fresh water. On the other hand, we also have an international client who is really looking at a very big ambitious program that none of his manufacturing locations would have zero fresh water withdrawal. It means that they want to look at business to run without any fresh water. And I would say these are really tall claims, and this is where the industries are really going to go. As far as the water situation is concerned, I personally feel that there are going to be times that the technology sector in the water and wastewater sector is going to boom. There would be technologies also on urine recycling, potentially. There could be market instruments on water. There could be large companies, maybe Aditya Birla, Reliance, who would be the private sector water utilities. And I'm telling you, mark my words, I personally feel this is going to be the situation in water. As far as RTIs is concerned, I can quickly say that we are a group of scientists, and we believe in collecting data in terms of helping utilities making the right decisions on water planning, allocation with respect to climate change. We also support large cities in terms of flood management for flood forecasting. We work in industries to tell them what water security should be all about and preparing them to grapple with this challenge. And the last thing is on the technology side, to a large sector of technology providers, we help them to take their new technology from lab to market. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I have a question, because you talked about the fact that industries are limited in terms of access to the availability of water. So I'm sure that you are also helping them in managing conflicts in usage, especially with the agricultural sector as well. But my question would be, in this discussion, how sanitation is in the heart of this discussion or not?
So I would say, as I told you, one of my clients, he doesn't have even the sewage water from the municipality. So he's really struggling to look at open drains, which are nothing but septage coming out of the open drains, and there is a big pond over there, and he's looking at actually taking water from it. So I'm just trying to say the industries are really grappling with water, and they're looking at avenues and ways of doing it. It's up to us and platforms like TBC to see that how you facilitate them with the government, with the other local NGOs. And as you said, conflict is a real great challenge as far as industries are concerned. And I would say, I was with the CEO where he was talking on the Sustainability Summit. Out of 2 hours that he spoke, I would say 80% he spoke on water. So I'm just trying to say they are looking at ways and means of solving their problem, because it's all about their existence.
Thank you very much. So we're talking about conflicts of usage and fighting for existence. I think, Erik, the world poorest communities in rural and urban areas are often the ones that suffer the most the impact of water security issues. However, we know that their voice are not so much heard or listened to. And I would like to know, as an NGO, how WATERAID is supporting these communities in raising their voice about being able to ask for their rights and being able to ask for their rights to have a safer environment. But also, is it a key, because we know demand for sanitation is not always very high, is it also a key to boost the demand from this community to have a safer and more sustainable sanitation systems?
Great, thanks. Morning, everybody. It's very dark at the back there. I hope you're not sleeping. Thanks for that question. And I think critically, I think we all know that for water security to be a reality, not only do we need well-managed water resources, we need well-managed water services or WASH services, and we also need to really critically look at the water-related risk management. And I say this before I answer the specific question, because I think we really need to understand what some of those critical risks are, and some of the underlying risks related to those. And they may not be the ones that we would normally naturally talk about, such as pollution. But I think it's been alluded to already. It's around the political, social, and economic imbalances that exist in our societies. You know, only about 10 or up to 10% of the freshwater resources that exist on Earth are the ones that we really need for basic human needs. And therefore, as a water user, that often sits right at the bottom of these imbalances on demands of water. But the other ones that really the other big risks are issues of weak governance, the weak institutional arrangements or systems that drive water systems and run water systems, continued population growth in shifting population spaces, changing water use, land uses as a result. And then, of course, the climate crisis becomes a major exacerbating factor to all of those other risks. And so all of these things come into play when we look at how that then impacts on the poorest and most marginalized. And they are the ones who will feel the impacts of all of these weaknesses in the first instance. So it's really good to hear the examples coming now out of India of taking system-wide solution approaches to respond to all of those threats. At WATERAID, we work really across the whole spectrum. We work not only on the one side, alongside and with government in strengthening the governance and management of the WASH systems, but we also work on the community and civil society side on building their knowledge and their understanding of these threats so that they can engage in intelligent debates and intelligent demand processes with their governments and service providers. And WATERAID and its partners, and more so its partners, often play a role in creating the spaces for that dialogue to really happen. We also work through the global private sector in terms of them realizing their role in terms of how investment in strong WASH services, both in the workplace and within their supply chains, matters, and also how they treat and manage the water that they use. The pollution threat, and I think we often think of water security through the lens of quantity of water. We don't think of it through the lens of water quality. And with a limited freshwater resource on the planet, increasingly we're seeing the types of contamination to our freshwater resources, almost putting a lot of that water out of economic use. Contamination gets so bad that actually economically treating it and putting it back into use becomes a major barrier. So it's really encouraging that looking at this through the lens of the sanitation economy puts this really into stark focus, because in these financially resource-restrained environments, getting money back into the system through the opportunities created through the likes of the sanitation economy really become critical. And in so doing, create the opportunities to make those services a lot more affordable to the poorest and most marginalized in society. So back specifically to your question, I think it's not normally in the front and the center of poor people's minds that contamination of the water resource equals lack of water equals lack of sanitation services. What matters to poor people is a well-managed, sufficient water and sanitation service, and that requires strong WASH systems to be in place, both at governance level, but also the use and the management of those services by the private sector. And so creating those dialogue spaces and bringing the people back into the equation in the process of planning, operations and management becomes a really critical factor in this.
Thank you. Kala, so we had these two very complementary point of view, and I'd like to have your point of view. I mean, IWA is a global organization. You're really acting internationally. We've seen in the last COPs that water is an issue that is raising and being more and more taken into account within the climate change discussions and all. I'd like to have your view on how this subject of water security has been evolving in the last 5 to 10 years in the international debate and in the global debate, and how your members and how you are supporting your members in participating in this discussion and also participating in bringing solutions and examples to this discussion.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you for that question. I think what we see within the water sector is, in response to some of these issues around water security, is major changes in the perspective that they have around water. And so what we see now is water professionals thinking much more about the productive use of water. What is it that they want the water to do for them? How do they match the quantity and the quality of water for that intended use? And this is really driven by the issue of water scarcity. And the outcome of this is that they start to recognize that they don't need high quality drinking water to do everything, and that they can have different grades of water for different purposes. And connected to this is, if you take the urban water sector, for example, it's viewing all the flows of water that take place within an urban water cycle through a single lens. So it's both the unused water or the drinking water side of the cycle, the rainwater side, and then the used water, and viewing it through a single lens and recognizing that all of those water flows are good waters. They're just waters of different qualities. And then what you're able to do is, when you have an increasing need for water, rather than thinking about only moving water from afar to meet that growing demand, you start to look at efficiency gains from within your system. And so if you want to have some extra drinking water, you would invest rather in leakage reduction, let's say, and demand conservation rather than extracting from afar. If you want water for flushing your toilets, the question will be, do we need water at all? And then if you do, then can you use a different grade of water? And so what that perspective has done is to really recognize the importance of cascading the uses of water and reusing water. And so it's put sanitation really very much in the center of everything that we're thinking about, because all of the gains are really coming from that part of the water cycle. And so what you see investments in some very innovative technologies and the development of some very innovative technologies that try to capture that value from the waste stream. And that's the second big change in perspective, which I know all of you have been talking about, is this resource recovery reuse perspective. And it's seeing how can we design our systems and where should we locate our systems in a way where we can maximize that capture of value. And we see, for example, in peri-urban areas, the synergy, the transfer of benefits from the agricultural sector and the urban water sector in terms of co-digesting, agro-industrial waste with municipal waste, with wastewater to maximize energy production, for example. And so the water sector has responded to these issues really by these changes in perspective. And what you see in terms of both wastewater technologies and non-sewage sanitation technologies is this idea that there is a lot of water there's a lot of water embedded here. That water has a lot of value. And how can we sort of cleverly design our systems in a way where we can extract that value, rather than looking at it as a treatment process? It's more of how can we extract some of those values. And what you see, if you take the centralized wastewater system technologies, the last 50 years in the developed world, or the last 30 to 40 years, was really like a big pilot study. And they had large, very clunky, sort of centralized infrastructure systems. But now, over time, they've started to develop technologies that make these systems much smaller. They are much more energy efficient. In some cases, they're producing net energy potential. And their CapEx and OpEx costs are reduced. And so I think the water professionals view the next 20 years as the golden era in terms of wastewater and sanitation. And they think that this is really going to take off in the emerging economies in South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa, and both in terms of, opportunities for centralized infrastructure, but more, I think, in the area of non-sewage sanitation. IWA, through its specialist groups, has developed some really, really interesting technologies. And so the developing countries can learn a lot from the mistakes that were made in the West. Because in the West, if we were to start from scratch, we wouldn't design the systems the way we design them. I mean, clearly we wouldn't use drinking water to flush our toilets. It's really not what we would do. And so I'm really optimistic about how I see sanitation being delivered in these emerging economies, because there is so much focus and so much effort, and the SDGs has sort of, crystallized a lot of the ideas that people have had in the past. So yeah, that's how IWA is moving in that direction.
Thank you very much. I have a question, or maybe if you want to share, each of you, with us one example that for you is very exemplary of what should be done in terms of water security, and that helps in sanitation. We talked about economic resilience, we talked about technology innovations, we talked about the fact that we need to push for political issues. So can you just share one project quickly that is really for you one example to follow and that can inspire the room?
So I would say I have many examples, but let me be focused. I think I was more impressed with Ford. What Ford did was, across all of their locations, they decided that they are going to be not dependent on any fresh water. It means that they will focus more on sanitation, related wastewater, whether it is sewage water or fecal sludge management. The most important thing was, when you take up a journey like this, it's going to be really difficult. But yes, at the end of it, they see that how the business disruptions can be kept at a bare minimum. So that was the objective. The second thing, which was also, I would say, extremely ambitious, is that they looked at some of their 10 important suppliers, and they also started implementing the program for them. So I would say that this is the level where other international organizations are going around. Also, one more example which I think is happening currently in US, and that's at the government level, is governments are really looking at the food, energy, water nexus. And I think, as you know, food, as far as India is concerned, we say food for all, energy for all, water for all. But when you say all of these for all, it's a kind of pressure that each of these resources have on them, and they're interrelated and dependent on each other. So a lot of governance structures, institutional structures, and policy making and allocation have been really looking at this whole aspect of this few nexus in terms of really taking a step back and deciding, if this is for all, what is that we really need to do? So I would say that these are some of the market stuff which are happening, which definitely India needs to learn and move forward.
Yeah, again, trying to choose one example. I think the one that probably exemplifies most is some work we've done with the town of Babati in Tanzania, which really exemplifies the space of how you work across the entire system and bring the citizens of that town back into the equation. And the work we did there was working very closely alongside the Water Services Authority, the municipality, the community-based structures, and also a local university. And it was all about really properly analyzing the citywide development planning process and how WASH really fitted within that. And we went through a process of creating the spaces for dialogue, using the real data from the real, real clean information, not assumptions and perceptions, on really analyzing that situation together and coming up with solutions. And the pre-written master plan for the town, which was 60-odd, 70-odd pages, had a page and a half on sanitation, and it just said sewers in the beginning. By the time we came, and it was a 2-year process, a very long but complicated and yet very important process, we ended up with a much more nuanced strategic approach towards eventually some areas of the city being served by sewers, but most of the city being served by decentralized on-site and decentralized systems. And that was just through proper engagement, and it's now a common known vision and strategy for the city and for the town that everybody knows, not just the few technocrats sitting in the office.
Project that I was involved in, this was before my time at IWA, was with the African Development Bank, and I really think the banks have, huge opportunities to incentivize people to transition from this sort of very clunky centralized approach to infrastructure to a more decentralized sort of circular economy approach. So in many cities in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, what they did was they created a model where they brought in experts that understood this transitional process, worked with the local utility to develop the terms of reference for bids that consultants would then bid on, to help develop the master plan and ultimately the final solution. And what was done, there was a model, because the consultants initially are quite lazy and they love to just put in centralized and, and they write beautiful reports that fool the utilities, but they don't want to even move out of their comfort zone of this sort of 19th century approaches to infrastructure. So this model was such that the utilities were backstopped by this expert group, so every proposal that came through was vetted and was reviewed and was sent back to say this is not really what we're looking for. And so ultimately you were able to get those consultants who were comfortable with helping these utilities transition to a more decentralized approach, resource recovery, reuse activities within that master plan. And then the master plan was developed. And this really, for me, shows the power of the development banks in, rewarding and creating an incentive model that encourages these utilities to transition out, because it's very easy for them. It's very easy to reinforce the old paradigm, because it's quite a complicated process, that transition process. So for me, I think, trying to get the banks to create that reward or incentive structure to create that transition is critical.
Thank you very much. I have a last question, maybe a bit provocative, but in this water security debate, so we talk about politics, economics, environmental justice, but there is one issue I didn't hear much is about ecosystems, and how dealing with water security is also about protecting, preserving, restoring our ecosystems as a means to also conserve water. So I'd like to have your point of view on that, and is this something, an issue that is in the debate, not in the debate, and why?
Thank you. It definitely is in the debate, and for me, water is a system of systems, right? And when you look at the watershed level, the role that the ecosystem plays in sort of sustaining your operation in the long term is really critical. And so I think where the water sector struggles is having that systems perspective, understanding the potential transfer of benefits, say from the ag sector to the urban sector, how the industry can benefit from, say, water from the city, and understanding how nature plays a role in sustaining all of that. And so within IWA, we have a strong nature-based group looking at nature-based solutions, but I think the hardest thing is to bring these actors together who can understand these transfer of benefits between these different competing water uses. I think everybody understands that if you mess up with nature, it's a very short-term solution. But we don't really have the models. I think so, I think it's a no-brainer. And I think the problem is we don't have good models that help us articulate some of those challenges, right? And certainly in the urban sector, we are shifting much more to nature-based solutions. And we understand that investments in nature offsets a lot of investments in sort of grey infrastructure, and that nature also has this adaptive capacity that allows us to deal with uncertainties that grey infrastructure doesn't. Grey infrastructure tends to lock us into a trajectory that doesn't allow us to then respond to some of the uncertainties associated with global change. So I do see a big shift in our understanding of the role that nature has in sort of, acting as like the kidneys of the whole system.
I think the question is really great, and I think I can take pride in saying that RTI does a lot of work on ecosystem management. We have a big team of scientists, and as I said, the subject is extremely complicated, and the data required for even designing an ecosystem development from a water perspective requires a number of specialists. So I would say we take pride in terms of looking at ecosystem development. We have supported several cities with respect to that. I feel that India soon has to undertake that, and soon the discussions on strategizing ecosystem development across India has to happen. We are protecting industries, we are protecting domestic water and all of that, but without, in absence of this, I would say it's null and void. So I would definitely urge India to take charge of it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think that's often the easiest thing to forget in the space where the demand for economic development, for this, that, and the next thing, everybody needs the water, and it's the easiest thing to forget, and it's the easiest thing to put to one side and say it's too complex, can't deal with it. And so I'll just give you a nice example of sometimes that actually one of the easiest ways in creating awareness around issues is in these dialogue spaces where we bring people together. One of the things we're trying now is to gamify a basic river system, using marbles on a slope with a mock river. And it's a very easy way to demonstrate that, if you look at all the off-takes in a particular river system, how that impacts on the water passing through into the wetland if it's a particular issue, etc. How doing very simple things and modifying weir designs and things can really change people's perspectives on how the water is actually used, and having that then as the dialogue space around what do we need to do in order to protect that wetland down the end of the river system. How are we using that wetland as humans? What does it mean for us? What does it mean for the entire river system? And then also the dialogues around the debates around, well, who gets what water for when, for wherefore, and what do we do when river flows start to drop, when we're facing a drought, which ones do we prioritize, etc. And that's a very simple and easy, understandable way to deal with these dialogues without going into long, data-heavy reports, etc. And it's an awareness factor, and it's bringing that back into focus that the ecosystem is critical.
When we do work on the ecosystem, I would say that there's a lot of data, and we help our client understand that with this data, if a scenario changes, what are going to be the impacts of it. So I would say it helps a decision maker really have at the back of his mind that his decision is impacting the ecosystem, and because of that, what that impact is. So I would say that since the awareness is not there, since the data is not there, people make decisions without that. So I think people need to really realize that.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can really applaud this really nice panel, and that really underline the complexity of this issue. I would like really to thank you to have given us this complete vision on the water security issue and how sanitation is key to it. I would maybe resume that to protect the ecosystem, we have to have an ecosystem thinking, maybe. So thank you very much.